This is the second 4.1b video. We're going to look at bias, a couple of different things that can influence or create bias in a sample survey, such as undercoverage, non-response, wording of the question. So let's think for a second about inference. Inference is the process of drawing conclusions about a population on the basis of sample data. So when we're taking a sample, the whole idea is to draw inference about the larger population. For instance, for an election, if they want to know who they think is going to win the election, they take a sample because it would take forever to interview and ask every person in the United States, and they use those samples to try and estimate who's going to win. And so we really need to make sure we have a representative sample of the population. Why the randomness? The reason we have random is to avoid bias. That's the number one thing. If people are randomly selected from the population, then there's no influence from human behavior. There's no favoritism. We can trust the laws of probability to help make inference. More on that in the future. Another thing to remember is larger samples give us better information. We have more about the population to use to make inference about the larger population. So a couple of things that we want to try and make sure we avoid are different sources of bias are undercoverage, non-response, response bias, and the wording of the question. Undercoverage is when people get left out. They never have a chance of being selected in the survey or in the sample. An example, an opinion poll collected by calling landline telephone numbers will miss households that only have cell phones or don't have landlines at all. Non-response bias occurs when an individual chosen for a sample cannot be contacted or refuses to participate. This can only occur after the sample has been selected. A lot of people confuse this with voluntary response. Voluntary response is when people are asked to call in and give their opinion. Non-response bias is different because people have already been selected in the sample. They're just not able to be contacted or they're refusing to participate. Response bias is when people may lie or be encouraged to answer in a way that's not necessarily the truth. For example, people give inaccurate answers and they may lie about their age, about their income, about their whether they use drugs or not. And sometimes when they're doing a survey, they may just make up answers because they don't understand the question. So all of this, they're responding, but they're having bias because they're not telling the truth. Wording of the question is another way that bias can be created. Sometimes questions can be confusing, or they can lead to influence how people respond. So let's take a look at 3 examples and I'll have you try a couple on your own. So for this problem, we're going to identify the bias for this scenario. Just before the presidential election of 1936, the magazine Literary Digest predicted, incorrectly as it turned out, that Alf Landon would defeat Roosevelt. Landon lost in a landslide. It turned out the magazine had only polled its subscribers, plus others from a list of automobile owners, and a list of people who had telephone service. All 3 groups had higher than typical incomes during the Great Depression. So the bias here is undercoverage. If they were only pulling from these lists, the people who subscribed, the people who had automobiles, and the people who had telephone services, then all the people that had lower income never had a chance of being selected into the sample. This was not a representative sample because low-income voters' opinions never had a chance of being included. Let's take a look at the second one. What % of Americans wash their hands after using the bathroom? It depends on how you collect the data. In a telephone survey of 1,006 US adults, 96% said they always wash their hands after using a public restroom. An observational study of 6,028 adults, in public restrooms told a different story. Only 85% of those observed washed their hands after using the restroom. Explain why the results of the two studies are so different. Now, this one is an example of response bias because the people who are on the telephone are more likely to respond saying that they always wash their hands, even if they don't, because they want to avoid that embarrassment. But the observational study is not asking people, it's just observing how many people do actually wash their hands. So again, it's response bias. And I also forgot to say that it most likely overestimates. We do need to make sure we're saying if it's going to be an over and underestimate based on the bias. Also, I think this probably breaks some laws. I doubt they can actually do an observational study in the bathroom. So not sure if you caught that. Finally, a survey paid for by makers of disposable diapers found that 84% of the sample opposed banning disposable diapers. Here is the actual question. It is estimated that disposable diapers account for less than 2% of the trash in today's landfills. In contrast, beverage containers, third-class mail, and yard waste are estimated to account for about 21% of the trash in landfills. Given this, in your opinion, would it be fair to ban disposable diapers? Do you think the estimate 84% is less than, greater than, or about equal to the percent of all people in the population who oppose banning disposable diapers? Explain your reasoning. So in this case, the survey found that it was 84%, but the wording of this question is really making it seem like disposable diapers aren't bad. They're telling us that disposable diapers only account for 2% compared to all of these other bad things that make up 21%. So after they've given that information, most people are going to respond saying that it's not fair to ban disposable diapers. They're not as bad as containers, third-class mail, and yard waste. So in this case, the wording of the question is biasing their responses. So based on the wording of this question, most people, after reading this, are going to be more inclined to say that it is not fair. So the proportion who would say yes to this question is smaller than the proportion who would say yes if the question were worded fairly. If they removed, if they didn't make diapers, or they didn't make these other things look much worse than diapers, then more people would have responded saying yes, that it would be fair to ban the disposable diapers. So with that in mind, that's a couple examples. Go ahead and see how you do figuring out what is the bias in these three here.